very early 911s, they had and actually still have a reputation for being, well, dangerous. Is that justified, or is it actually completely unfair?
It's difficult to say because not even I'm old enough to have been around at the time. But I have driven quite a few early 911s, and by an early 911, what I mean is a short wheelbase car, really. 2-litre engine, 1960s, mid to late 1960s, and I've never been scared by one. And I think there are probably two things. I have two advantages, which advantages weren't around back then. One is I'm not coming to it blind. I got into my first 911 well aware of the reputation of the 911. And also well aware of, the techniques that are required to drive one properly, the old slow in, fast out thing. And I think back then, people just got in them and expected to behave like normal cars, and they don't. They don't behave like normal. Even if you get into a modern, I drove a Cayman GT4 and a 911 Cup car the other day. And I went out and I drove the Cayman, and was very happy in it. Did some reasonable times, came back in and got into the Cup car, and was told immediately that if I drove the 911 like that, like I'd tried to drive the Cayman, then I'd just crash the car. Even now, with all that technology, 55 years on, you still have to drive them a certain way, and I know that. And back then they didn't. I think the second thing is, I just suspect that even the tyres that you put onto old 911s today are a great deal better than the tyres that they put on them back then. I think if there was an era when they were tricky, it's not the 60s actually. I think it was the sort of the late 70s when they started to put the new generation of very low profile tyres on them, and to make sure they didn't oversteer, they widened the rear track, they put an awful lot of rubber on the back, particularly relative to the amount of rubber they had on the front. So they understeered a lot. But what that did mean is that if you did find yourself in a situation where the back broke loose, particularly if you weren't on the power at the time, it started going and it tended to stay gone, particularly in the wet. And, the cars that I have found the most difficult to drive are things like SCs, G-Series Carreras, that sort of thing, particularly before the 993, which had the proper, first 911 to have a proper multi-link rear axle, and sorted out a lot of those problems. Because I think what they did in the early days, or in the sort of 70s and 80s, is they just chucked a lot of the rubber at the problem and tried to make sure that it would never oversteer. And you can't do that because all cars sooner or later will in certain conditions, particularly, a 911 lobbed into a wet roundabout, off the gas. Unless you then get back on the power really quite quickly and are quite accurate with your correction, they can be difficult.
Okay, so imagine the scenario. You're on a Welsh mountain B road. You know the road well. You're in what are you in? Let's say you're in an SC. So what's that? Early 80s car, maybe very late 70s?
Yeah, late 70s, early 80s, yeah.
Okay, it's a slightly greasy road. You're pelting along. You're approaching a right-hander. It's a second gear corner. Talk us through what the archetypal old 911 driving style is, and what's different about that compared to other cars.
Okay, I suppose it's you have to adapt the way you drive to the car's strengths. And with a car like that, clearly, you've got not a lot of weight in the nose, a lot of weight at the back, which means that particularly in the wet, under braking, and when the weight is transferred forward, you are going to run the risk of locking your front tyres, which they did a lot, and of breaking loose the rear if you try and turn in. So with that, you just try and do as much as you could in a straight line, and you just be very conservative, and you would get into the corner quite slowly. But then, as soon as you're in and the car is settled, then, the car's strengths start to emerge, which is traction. And as long as you're back on the power, even those SCs, you could get on the power early. And if the back moved, that was usually pretty okay because, it was moving under power, not under, weight transferred liftoff. And that is why, they were still very effective on tracks because they would come out of the corners so fast and then carry all that speed down the straight to come. So yeah, it's just, it's the oldest 911 cliche of them all. It's just slow in, fast out. Get it all done in a straight line. Be careful on entry and confident on exit.